I'm with Amanda Nettlebeck, famous Professor of History at the University of Adelaide, specialist in Australian and colonial frontier history. Welcome, Amanda. Amanda, tell us how widespread and how common flogging was in the Empire.
Corporal punishment until the early 19th century was a standard mode of punishment before the rise of the prison, or the prison as a replacement of corporal punishment, and it was widespread across every institution really. Anything that had a hierarchical structure that required punishment, so schools, slave plantations, penal settlements, the military, the navy. So as a means of establishing order, flogging was a legal punishment and was used widely.
So is it a distinction, can a distinction be made between corporal punishment and flogging? Is this corporal punishment, is that a sort of broad term for other forms of discipline other than flogging, or including flogging, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, well I think the lash is the shorthand for corporal punishment. If you go back into a kind of an earlier age, I guess corporal punishment extends into, other kind of, earlier medieval punishments. But in the kind of Enlightenment period, flogging is a shorthand for corporal punishment.
So pain and flogging are used as a tool of disciplining.
Yeah. That idea of bodily suffering as a deterrent, but also the spectacle of suffering. So the idea that to be seen to be suffering the body in pain is a deterrent. It's not just a punishment for the person being flogged, but it's a deterrent to people who witness it.
What point did a shift in attitudes begin to occur?
That really begins from the 1820s onwards. The first legislative controls around flogging occur from about 1820, where the emergence of 19th century sensibilities around respectability and decorum mean that women become the first people to be protected from flogging. So on the slave plantations and in prisons, women become exempt from flogging. But then that turned to an idea that flogging is a barbaric form of punishment, spreads to other institutions, so it becomes regulated on more widely for men in the slavery sector, in the penal settlements. There's big reformist movements to prevent flogging as a punishment in the military. Particularly that builds from about the mid-19th century. So
was that part of a campaign deliberately directed at flogging, or was it part of a larger humanitarian campaign that evolved out of the early 19th century?
Well, both those things are true. There were campaigns, specific campaigns against flogging, but it's very much tied to the broader reformist movement through the early to mid-19th century, which touched on every aspect really of society. So the perception that certain groups were vulnerable subjects, slaves, Aboriginal peoples, children, the labouring class of children in factories, all became subject to specific humanitarian interventions. But also the working poor more generally, refugees, that humanitarian shift to the politics of humanitarianism is part of a kind of broader appetite for reform and to legislate for reform through the courts in order to protect people who are vulnerable. So corporal punishment becomes wound up in that bigger movement.
Let's talk a little bit about flogging in the context of colonialism. Is there a differentiation to be made between flogging white men and some women and people of colour? In other words, did flogging become racialised?
Absolutely. By the mid-19th century, flogging has become all but abandoned for most social groups and has disappeared as the standard form of punishment in all those hierarchical institutions where it used to be standard. But it continues for Indigenous peoples across the British Empire, both in some colonies as a legal, judicial form of punishment, and very widespread as a kind of informal punishment visited on by settler masters onto Indigenous servants. And it's something then that was both kind of partially regulated through the law in some settler sites, and in other places was just part of a normative culture of controlling black subjects.
And do we know when it more or less disappeared from the empire, or did it continue right up and through to the post-war period?
It continues right through into the 20th century. In some of the British African colonies, it continues as a judicial punishment into the 20th century. In Australia, in Western Australia, it is repealed in the 1880s, but then re-emerges in the 1890s under the Aborigines Offenders Act as a legal punishment specifically racialised for Aboriginal offenders. And as part of what Russell Hogg calls a quasi-legal culture, which is not actually legal but is normative within the settler community, it continues well through the 20th century.
Thanks, Amanda. That's been incredibly enlightening.